He was holding a tray of champagne glasses when he said it. One word. Wrong woman, wrong room, wrong everything. The music stopped. 47 of the most powerful people in the city turned to look at the man in the borrowed uniform. A single father who owed 3 months of back rent and had no business being in that penthouse except to serve drinks and disappear. But Nathan Reed didn't flinch. And that was the moment Victoria Hale decided he was the most interesting man she'd encountered all year. If you've made it this far, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator was too slow. That was the first thing Nathan noticed when he stepped into the Meridian Tower's service entrance at 6:47 in the evening. 13 minutes before he was supposed to be upstairs, already in position, already invisible. The freight elevator groaned like something mechanical that had given up on life years ago and was simply going through the motions, and Nathan stood inside it with a folded garment bag draped over one arm and his phone pressed hard against his ear, listening to his landlord's voicemail message for the third time in an hour. Mr. Reed, this is Gerald Fitch from Fitch Property Management. I'm calling again regarding the outstanding balance on Unit 4C. As of today, that balance stands at $2,470. I need to hear from you by end of business Friday, or we'll have no choice but to begin proceedings. I'm sorry, Nathan. I really am, but I've got my own obligations here. He ended the call. Stared at the floor. The elevator groaned upward. $2,470. He'd been doing the math in his head for 3 weeks. His checking account had $412 in it. His credit card had a limit of $500 and was already at $480 from the pharmacy run last month when Lily had that ear infection that wouldn't quit. His mother could maybe loan him $300, but she was on a fixed income and had already helped him twice this year, and he told himself after the second time that he wasn't going to do that to her again, which left tonight. Tonight paid $350 for a 4-hour shift, $200 more than a standard catering gig because the client was some finance company hosting an event at the Meridian's penthouse level, and elite venues paid elite premiums even to the people carrying the trays. He'd grabbed the booking the second it came through the agency's scheduling app, had texted his neighbor, Mrs. Abara, to watch Lily, had dug out the black uniform pants that were technically too tight now, but would hold for one night if he didn't eat anything. $350 tonight. He was already booked for a corporate breakfast Saturday. $220. That was $570. He still needed $1,800 more. The elevator opened. Nathan stepped out into a world that operated by completely different physics. The penthouse floor of the Meridian Tower was not a room. It was a statement. Whoever had designed the space had made the deliberate choice to put the city itself on display. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling glass that turned Chicago into a backdrop, an accessory, something that existed primarily for the visual pleasure of the people drinking inside. The furniture was the kind that looked uncomfortable on purpose, all angular lines and pale upholstery that probably cost more per square foot than Nathan's entire apartment. Someone had arranged white orchids in low vases along a central table that stretched 15 feet and held an arrangement of canapés so precise they looked like architecture. 40, maybe 45 people. All of them the kind of dress that made clothing look like a language Nathan didn't speak fluently. Not just expensive, intentional. Every jacket, every cut, every watch chosen with the awareness that other people in the room would know exactly what it cost and calibrate accordingly. Nathan found the catering coordinator, a short, tightly wound woman named Priya, who pointed him toward the bar station without looking up from her tablet. "You're on champagne rotation," she said. "Full trays, counterclockwise, don't initiate conversation, and if anyone asks you anything about the menu, you say you'll get the head server. Don't freelance." "Got it." "And tuck in your shirt. You look like you drove here." He did tuck in his shirt. Then he loaded a tray with champagne flutes, took a breath, and began moving through the room. It took Nathan about 8 minutes to understand the basic architecture of the gathering. This was not a party. It was a negotiation dressed as a party, a collection of people who were all, in one way or another, performing for each other while pretending they weren't. He'd worked enough of these events in the past 2 years to read the room. The ones who talked loudest and moved in the widest arcs were usually the least secure. The quiet ones near the windows, the ones who seemed to be only half listening, those were the ones who actually held things. He clocked the power center almost immediately. She was standing near the east window, slightly apart from the main cluster of guests, with a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, in one hand and the measured, evaluating expression of someone who was deciding whether the conversation she was currently in was worth continuing. She was listening to a broad-shouldered man in a gray suit talk about something that seemed to require a lot of hand gestures, and she was doing the thing that people with real authority do when they're bored, giving about 40% of her attention while her eyes quietly inventoried the rest of the room. Nathan didn't know who she was. He knew she was important the way you know a storm is coming, not because anyone told you, just because the air changed. He moved on, counterclockwise. His phone buzzed in his pocket at 7:23. He wasn't supposed to have it out, but he'd set it to vibrate only for anything from Mrs. Ibarra's number, which was the only exception he permitted himself during shifts. He stepped toward the service alcove near the kitchen pass-through and checked the screen. Mrs. Ibarra. Lily won't eat her dinner, says her tummy hurts. Nothing serious, I think, but wanted you to know. He typed back quickly. Thank you. Can you try the plain rice in the cabinet above the stove? She'll eat that. Should be fine. She gets nervous when I'm not home. He was putting the phone back in his pocket when it buzzed again immediately. Not Mrs. Ibarra this time. Gerald Fitch. An actual call. He should have let it go to voicemail. He answered it. Mr. Fitch, I'm at work right now. I can't really... Nathan, I got a call from my attorney today. Fitch's voice was apologetic and firm in equal measure. They're pushing me to move faster on this. If I don't have a payment plan in writing by Monday morning, I have to start the paperwork. I don't want to do this to you. I know about your daughter, but I've got 4 units and a mortgage of my own. You understand? I understand. Nathan was trying to keep his voice down, moving slightly further into the alcove, angling his body away from the main room. I'm working right now. I'll have something for you by Monday. I just need... How much can you put down? I don't know yet. I'm working on it. Nathan, I'm working on it. The words came out harder than he meant them to. He squeezed his eyes shut for a half second. I'm sorry, give me until Monday. I'll call you Monday morning. Fitch sighed. Monday morning, okay. Nathan ended the call and turned around. A woman was standing 12 inches away from him, close enough that he nearly walked into her. He'd been so deep in the call that he hadn't heard her approach, hadn't clocked her at all, and his body's automatic response, the apology that comes before thought, before recognition, before anything, came out of him before he fully registered who was standing there. Sorry, baby, I didn't see you. The word landed. He heard it the way you hear a glass break. First the sound, then the full realization of what just happened. The woman standing in front of him was the one from the window. Up close, she was sharper than she'd seemed from across the room. Not in an unfriendly way, but in the way of someone who had spent years in environments where softness gets read as weakness and had learned to keep her edges clean. Dark hair pulled back, but not severely. A charcoal blazer over something the color of deep water, the sparkling water still in her hand. And she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. Not offense, not amusement, something more precise than either. He also realized, in the same half-second, that the room had gotten quieter. Not completely silent, but quieter. The kind of quiet that spreads outward from a focal point. Nathan stopped, started again. I was on the phone. I'm sorry. That was completely unintentional, she said. Yes. You weren't looking where you were going. No, I wasn't. She tilted her head slightly, just a degree or two, like someone adjusting a lens. Whose baby? My landlord. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. That's an unusual term of endearment for a landlord. He's threatening eviction. My brain... Nathan stopped again because he was standing in a penthouse he had no real claim to, explaining his financial situation to a woman he'd just accidentally called baby in front of 45 people who were definitely listening, and the sentence had nowhere good to go. My brain misfired. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. I didn't say it bothered me. She said it simply, no coy inflection, no setup, just the statement. Nathan looked at her steadily for a moment. He was tired enough and stressed enough that whatever social filter usually caught his more honest observations had slipped about 3 inches out of position. "You're the host," he said. "I am. I should probably get back to—" In a minute, she glanced at the tray he was holding, which had precisely 1 champagne flute left on it. "What did your landlord want?" "A payment plan." "And do you have one?" "Not yet." She considered that. "You're not embarrassed." "I'm plenty embarrassed," Nathan said. "I'm just not going to perform it for a room full of people who are pretending not to listen." At that, something actually broke through. A brief, real expression that crossed her face and was gone before he could fully name it. Not the suggestion of a smile this time. The actual thing, small and quickly contained. "Victoria Hale," she said, and extended her free hand. "Nathan Reed." He shook it. Her grip was brief and direct. "I'm the catering staff." "I know what you are." She said it without condescension, which made it land differently than he expected. "What were you before this?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you just told a room full of investors that you're facing eviction without flinching, and now you're looking at me like the question is the strange part." She paused. "I'm curious about people who don't panic. It's rarer than it sounds." He shifted the tray to his other hand. "Line cook mostly. Some construction work when the restaurant hours weren't enough. 1 year doing deliveries. Before all of that, I was in a culinary management program. Didn't finish." "Why not?" "My daughter was born." She didn't make a sound to fill that. Didn't offer a reflexive response. Just held it for a beat. Nathan found himself appreciating that. "How old?" she asked. 7. "Her name's Lily." "And her mother?" Nathan kept his voice level. It was an old practiced steadiness. "Not in the picture." Victoria Hale absorbed that with the same quiet attention she seemed to bring to most things. Around them, the room had reestablished its social noise. People had returned to their conversations. The particular audience of the moment had dissolved. But she didn't seem in any hurry to return to the event she was hosting. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "You can say no." "Okay." "I have 9 events over the next 4 weeks. Dinners, conferences, 1 gallery opening. I typically attend them with a colleague or alone, and both options have become," she chose the word carefully, "complicated. I'm looking for someone to attend as my companion, public-facing, present and coherent, not a date in any way that matters, a professional arrangement." Nathan stared at her. He genuinely could not tell if this was a joke, and he'd become a decent reader of rooms. "You're serious?" "I don't make social offers at my own events for entertainment. My calendar is already full." "You called me to your event." I walked 12 steps across a room. "Nathan." She said his name like she was just testing it, checking its weight. "The answer is that you didn't flinch. In a building full of people who perform confidence as a product, you got caught in a genuinely embarrassing moment and you stood there and just were honest about it. That's either stupidity or character. I've learned to bet on the latter." He thought about $2,470. He thought about Lily's ear infection prescription, about Mrs. Ibarra's patient text, about Gerald Fitch's apologetic firmness. "What does the arrangement pay?" he asked. She named a number. Nathan's face didn't change. His chest did. "Per event?" "Per event. Plus any incidentals. Appropriate clothing if necessary, transportation. The work is simple. Show up. Be present. Don't embarrass either of us." The tray in his hand had 1 champagne flute left on it. He'd been holding it so long the condensation had run down across his palm. He set it on the nearest flat surface. "When's the first event?" He got home at 11:40, let himself into the apartment as quietly as he could, and found Mrs. Ibarra asleep in the armchair with her reading glasses still on, and Lily asleep on the couch with a half-eaten bowl of plain rice on the coffee table. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at his daughter in the dim lamplight. She'd gotten his nose. The slightly crooked one, broken twice. She'd gotten her mother's mouth, the one that curved easily into smiles she didn't entirely mean. She had a gap between her 2 front teeth that the pediatric dentist said would correct itself, and Nathan had privately decided he'd be sad about when it did. He settled Mrs. Ibarra's cardigan more securely over her shoulders without waking her, gathered Lily with the practiced ease of a man who'd been doing this since she was 11 pounds, and carried her to her bed. "Daddy," she murmured without opening her eyes. "I'm here. I ate the rice." "I know. Good job. Mrs. Ibarra put too much butter. I'll mention it." He tucked her in, stood for a moment in the dark room, and then went to the kitchen and sat at the table with his phone. He looked at Victoria Hale's business card. She'd produced it at the end of the event with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. An ivory card, no title, just her name, and a direct number below it. He turned it over in his fingers. He did what he always did when he was making a decision that scared him. He thought about it from the outside. If someone else described the situation to him, what would he say? A billionaire CEO at a fancy event offered me money to be her arm candy for a month. That's how it would sound at a bar. That's how Eddie from the catering agency would describe it, with a laugh and a raised eyebrow. It sounded like something that ended badly in one of those stories people share online. The ones that start with, "So this thing happened to me," and end with, "And that's how I almost got arrested." But he'd stood in front of Victoria Hale and looked at her directly, and she hadn't struck him as unstable or reckless or operating from some ulterior place he couldn't locate. She struck him as busy and controlled and genuinely, practically curious. She wanted something functional. She described it clinically, a professional arrangement. He thought about the money. He thought about Lily's face when Mrs. Ibarra gave him back for the night. That particular expression she wore when she'd been holding herself together all evening and finally got to let go. The one where her whole face just softened. The kid never complained. She was 7 years old and she never complained about the apartment, or the secondhand backpack, or the nights he came home late smelling like other people's parties. She just waited for him and then collapsed with relief when he showed up, and it destroyed him quietly every single time. He put the card on the table face up. He was going to call the number in the morning. The morning brought logistics. The first event was in 6 days. A private dinner at a lakefront venue, 12 guests, semi-formal. Nathan texted the number on the card at 8:15. The response came in 4 minutes. Confirmed. A car will pick you up at 6:30 p.m. on the 14th. Attire details will follow this afternoon. VH. The attire details arrived at 2 p.m. in the form of a text message from an unknown number identifying itself as belonging to a woman named Cassandra, who described herself as Victoria's EA. The text contained a list of what was expected: charcoal or navy suit, not black, pocket square optional, leather shoes, not loafers, and an address for a clothing store in the Gold Coast that Nathan had never been inside and had previously assumed was for a different category of human being than himself. He called Cassandra. Are they expecting me at the store?" "Yes, Mr. Reed, they'll have options pulled. Everything will be charged to the account." He paused. "Look, I have a decent suit, a navy one. I've worn it to interviews and Mr. Reed," Cassandra's voice was not unkind. "Please go to the store." He went to the store. The man who helped him was named Dario, was approximately 60 years old, and had the contained professional judgment of someone who sized up clients in the first 10 seconds and adjusted his manner accordingly. He did not treat Nathan with condescension. He also did not pretend Nathan had been there before. He simply moved efficiently through options, held jackets up, noted alterations that needed to happen, and within 40 minutes had assembled something that made Nathan, looking at himself in the mirror, go briefly and involuntarily still. He didn't look like a different person. He looked like the same person with different resources. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. He got home at 5, checked Lily's homework, made pasta because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were pasta since she was 3 years old, and he'd made the mistake of asking her what she wanted for dinner in a moment of exhausted deference, and she'd chosen pasta, and now it was encoded in her personal law of the universe. "You look different," she said, looking up from her word search. "I went to a store." "A fancy one?" "A fancy one." Lily processed this with the thoroughness of a 7-year-old assessing a significant data point. "Did you get me anything?" "No, it was a grown-up store." "That's selfish," she said, and went back to her word search. He laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprised him, a full thing that came from somewhere below his sternum. and stood in his small kitchen stirring pasta with a suit he couldn't have afforded hanging in the closet, and the evening was simple and ordinary and exactly what he needed it to be before everything complicated began. The private dinner was on a Tuesday. He was ready at 6:15. The car was there at 6:28, a black sedan driven by a man named Marco, who said exactly 4 words for the entire 30-minute drive. "Mr. Reed?" When Nathan came down to the street, an arrival in 2 minutes, when they were approaching the venue. Nathan appreciated the discipline of it. The venue was a converted lakefront property, what had been, at some point, an industrial building, and was now exposed brick and warm light and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. The kind of conversion that costs enough money that it stops announcing what it used to be and just becomes what it is now. Victoria was already there. He almost didn't recognize her at first, which surprised him. He'd been thinking of her in terms of the penthouse, controlled, evaluating, holding herself slightly apart. This version was the same person with the same fundamental quality of attention, but calibrated for the environment. The dress was deep red, not dramatic but precise. She was talking to an older man with silver hair and the weathered tan of someone who spent a lot of time on boats, and she was listening to him with what seemed like genuine interest, which Nathan had already filed as unusual. Most powerful people he'd observed were waiting for their turn to speak while pretending to listen, and she actually seemed to be taking in what was said. She saw Nathan come in. Something organized itself in her expression. He couldn't tell if it was relief or simple recognition. She said something brief to the silver-haired man and moved toward Nathan with the efficiency of someone who had already mapped out the evening and knew exactly where each piece was supposed to land. "You made it," she said. "You doubted it?" "No." She looked at him. Not the way a person looks when they're checking someone's appearance, more the way they look when they're confirming a professional assessment. "The suit works." "Dario is good at his job." "He is. I've been sending people to him for years." She fell into step beside him, moving naturally toward the group near the window. 12 people tonight. 4 of them I genuinely like. 3 are useful to keep warm professionally. The rest are here because declining would have cost more than attending. "Which category am I?" She glanced at him sideways. There was something in it, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent. "Undetermined. I'll let you know at the end of the month." The dinner itself was a masterclass in the particular energy of wealthy people attempting to appear relaxed. Nathan sat 2 seats from Victoria, near enough to be present, and far enough not to be obvious about it. The table conversation moved through the standard rotations, market conditions, recent travel, real estate in areas Nathan had never been to and couldn't have afforded to visit. He ate and listened and said very little, which turned out to be its own form of social capital in a room where everyone else was working very hard to say the right things. The woman on his left was named Patricia Drummond, late 50s, and was apparently a significant institutional investor. She asked Nathan, with the direct curiosity of someone used to vetting people, what he did. He told her he was in hospitality management. It was true enough. He managed hospitality for a living. He just managed it from the other side of the tray. "Independently?" Patricia asked. "Mostly freelance," Nathan said. Which was also true. She seemed to find this mildly interesting rather than dismissive. "How's that?" "Unpredictable," he said. "But it's mine." Patricia Drummond looked at him for a moment in a way that felt like recalibration. "That's a good answer," she said, with the tone of someone who had heard a lot of bad ones. He didn't try to capitalize on it. Didn't extend the conversation into territory it hadn't been invited into. He just turned back to his plate, and Patricia Drummond turned to the man on her left, and the dinner moved on. Across the table, he caught Victoria watching him. She looked away before he could decide what the look meant. After the dinner, the car brought him home. He sat in the back seat and looked at the city moving past the windows and tried to figure out what had actually happened over the course of the evening. He'd expected to feel out of place. He'd expected the kind of social discomfort that comes from being in a room built for different people, the low-level friction of not knowing the codes. Instead, what he'd felt was something closer to curiosity. These people were not, at close range, as different as they appeared from outside their ecosystem. They had the same anxieties wearing more expensive clothes. His phone buzzed. The Patricia Drummond conversation was well handled. She doesn't give compliments easily. VH. He looked at the text for a moment. How do you know what she said? 3 minutes passed. She told me on the way out. She said you were unusually unambitious for someone who appears to have things figured out. For Patricia, that's practically a love letter. He laughed. Again. Twice in one day, which was a rate he hadn't been hitting lately. What does unusually unambitious mean as a compliment? It means she thinks you're not interested in using her for anything. In her world, that's exotic. He put the phone down and watched the city go by. He thought about Lily at home with Mrs. Ibarra. He thought about Gerald Fitch's payment plan. He thought about the 9 events stretched ahead of him like a string of something he couldn't quite name. Opportunity, obviously, but also something else. Something that felt, even this early, like it might get complicated. He thought about Victoria Hale looking across the table with an expression he couldn't read. He told himself to be careful. He was a practical man. He'd been a practical man since the night Lily was born, and he'd sat in a hospital corridor at 25 and understood that everything that came after that moment would be organized around keeping her okay. Practical men don't get complicated. They don't read things into dinner table glances. They don't mistake professional curiosity for something warmer. He told himself all of this with the conviction of a man who knows he's going to have to say it again. The car stopped in front of his building. He let himself in, checked on Lily, stood in the hallway outside her door, listening to her breathe. She was deeply asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress in the way she did when she was dreaming. He went to the kitchen and transferred his first payment from the account Cassandra had set up into his checking account, watched the numbers adjust, did the mental arithmetic about the month ahead. It was going to be enough. If everything held, it was going to be enough. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside his window, Chicago ran its overnight circuits, trucks, trains, the specific urban white noise he'd been falling asleep to for 4 years. He lay in the dark and thought about a woman in a red dress who said things with precision and held her expressions close, and had looked at him across a table of 12 people with something he refused for the time being to name. Sleep took a while to come. When it did, it came solidly, the way it does for people who work with their body and carry weight that isn't physical. The next event was in 4 days. He'd be ready. The second event was a corporate cocktail reception at a gallery in the Loop. 200 guests, standing format, the kind of gathering where everyone moved and circulated, and the goal was to be seen by as many people as possible in the least amount of time. Nathan was better at this one. He'd spent the 4 days between events paying attention, watching how Victoria moved through rooms, how she allocated her attention, where she applied the slight softening that signaled genuine interest versus the bright, practiced engagement she ran on standby when the interaction required presence but not investment. He'd done this not because he was strategizing, but because he was genuinely interested. She was good at this. She was very good at it. And watching her work the social machinery of her professional world, while simultaneously remaining slightly outside it, still that quality of being half present, half somewhere else, was instructive in a way he hadn't expected. He also started noticing the things she deflected. Compliments about her appearance, deflected with precision, never with false modesty, just redirected efficiently toward something substantive. Questions about her personal life, absorbed and turned without seeming evasive. Anything that probed at the person behind the professional, handled with the controlled grace of someone who had been doing this so long that the redirects were automatic. At the gallery reception, a man named Carl Bowers, hedge fund, significant, the third time he'd circled back to Victoria in the same evening, tried for the fourth time to extend their conversation past what it needed to be, and Nathan watched Victoria's face do something subtle and swift, a fractional tightening, a recalibration toward patience, the expression of someone bracing for a conversation they've had 17 times with different men wearing the same face. Nathan stepped into the circle. Victoria, sorry to interrupt. There's someone near the Miro piece who's been trying to catch your eye for the last 10 minutes. Older woman, silver jacket. He'd made it up. There was no such person, but it gave her a direction and an exit. She looked at him. He kept his face neutral, factual. "Excuse me, Carl," she said, and they moved. They ended up near a series of large-scale abstracts in the back gallery, away from the main circulation. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at a canvas, blue and ochre, aggressive brushwork. Silver jacket, she said. I know. Thank you. He looked at the painting. Who is he? Carl Bowers manages a fund that's invested in 3 of my portfolio companies. She said it evenly. He's never going to do anything. He's also never going to stop. Does he know that distinction? Men like Carl have worked very hard to reach a point where they don't have to know distinctions like that. She paused. They live in a state of perpetual plausible deniability. Nathan nodded. He'd known men like that. Not in boardrooms, in kitchens, in construction sites, in the particular social ecosystem of working-class spaces where the same dynamics existed with different textures and no expense accounts. You've dealt with that a lot, he said. Not a question. Since I was 22 and had one successful quarter and suddenly became someone worth noticing. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder. He looked at her. Does it get easier? She thought about it, actually considered the question, which he'd started to understand was a thing she did, a refusal to offer reflexive answers. No, she said. You just get better at managing it. It's not the same thing. Something in the gallery's ambient sound shifted. A cluster of guests moving through from the main room, voices rising briefly and then settling. Victoria glanced toward them, then back at the painting. The Lily situation, she said. 7 years alone. How? He almost laughed at the directness of it. What do you mean, how? I mean, how do you manage the... She made a gesture that was oddly imprecise for her, a small circle of her hand that seemed to indicate the whole of it, the loneliness, the logistics, the weight of being the only person responsible for another person. All of it, simultaneously. You figure out what's essential and you cut everything else. He considered the painting. Like, I used to have hobbies. I played guitar. I went out on weekends. I had a whole social infrastructure that seemed necessary and turned out to be optional. When Lily came, all the optional stuff fell away. And what was left was actually, it was simpler, harder, but simpler. Victoria was quiet. Does that sound terrible? He asked. No. She seemed surprised by her own answer. It sounds clarifying. He looked at her. She was looking at the painting with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something loosened, something that might have been close to wistful if it had been given permission to go further. He thought about what Lily had said about his suit. That's selfish. He thought about the way his 7-year-old could absorb the world with the same flat honesty he was watching from this woman 30 years her senior, and how funny and sad it was that the quality of attention didn't change, just the stakes around it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. The arrangement, the 9 events. He kept his voice even. You run a billion-dollar company. You have a staff. You have a whole apparatus of people whose job is managing your world. Why this? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, she said, because everyone else in my apparatus wants something from my world. And the one thing I can't afford is someone who wants something from my world. She said it simply, as a statement of fact, and then she turned from the painting and moved back toward the main gallery, and Nathan stood alone for a moment in front of the blue and ochre canvas, holding what she'd said, turning it over. He followed her back into the crowd. 4 events in, 5 to go. He told himself again, with the diligence of a man building a habit, to be careful. He told himself this while watching her work the room from across a gallery full of people who were all, in one way or another, trying to get something from her world. And he thought about what it meant to want nothing, and he thought about how long that was going to stay true. The 5th event was a corporate conference. Not a dinner, not a reception, a full-day affair at the Meridian Convention Center, the kind that came with a printed program and breakout sessions and name badges laminated in plastic that cost $11 apiece. The Hale Capital Emerging Markets Summit drew 400 attendees from across the financial sector, and it was, as Cassandra explained in her briefing text, the most professionally significant event on the schedule. Nathan read that text at 6 a.m. while making Lily's lunch. Grape jelly on wheat, cut diagonal, apple slices, the small bag of cheddar crackers she'd become obsessed with since her friend Dominique brought them to school 3 weeks ago. He packed the lunchbox, read the text again, and thought about what most professionally significant meant for a man whose professional significance in this context was essentially cosmetic. He found out when the program arrived in his email an hour later. Victoria was the keynote speaker. The afternoon panel, Capital Allocation in Emerging Markets, Risk, Reward, and Responsibility, listed her as moderator. In between those two anchors, she would be in meetings, on camera twice, and navigating the particular social minefield of a conference where everyone in the room was professionally adjacent to everyone else, and the stakes of every conversation were, accordingly, invisible and significant. He was her companion. He was going with her into all of it. Marco picked him up at 7:45. The convention center was already loud when they arrived. Not the mannered restraint of a dinner or gallery event, but a working noise, the friction of 400 people who all knew each other in complicated ways, moving through registration lines with their phones out and their networking engines running. Nathan clipped on his badge, Nathan Reed, guest of Hale Capital, and found Victoria near the speaker prep area, standing with a woman he didn't know and a man he recognized from a financial news segment he'd watched once while waiting for Lily's ballet class to end. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, slightly compressed. Not nervous. The word wasn't right. More like someone who had loaded everything correctly and was running the final checks before a demanding run. When she saw him, something in her face eased by approximately 1 degree. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early." "Good habit." She turned briefly to the woman beside her. "This is Dr. Amara Osei. She's presenting on infrastructure bonds in the afternoon session. Amara, Nathan Reed." Dr. Osei was maybe 45, with the efficient handshake of an academic who had learned the business world's social grammar. She looked at Nathan with frank curiosity. "Are you in finance, Nathan?" "No," he said. "I'm in hospitality." "Consulting?" "Operations." Dr. Osei nodded in the way people do when they're not entirely sure what they just heard, but are too polished to ask for clarification. Victoria's mouth did the thing, the almost smile, controlled and brief, and she excused herself to finish her prep. Nathan was on his own for 40 minutes. He did not stand near a wall scrolling his phone, which was his instinct. Instead, he walked the floor the way he walked a catering event, methodically, paying attention, cataloging. He helped himself to the conference coffee, which was exactly as mediocre as conference coffee always was, regardless of who was paying for it. And he listened to 3 different conversations without inserting himself into any of them, and he began to build a working map of the room's social architecture. That's how he first noticed Derek Whitmore. Whitmore was easy to identify. His name was on the program as a panelist, and he looked exactly like his headshot, which was the headshot of a man who had sat for it knowing it would be used to establish dominance. Jaw forward, eyes direct, the controlled affect of someone who had decided long ago that appearing relaxed was for people with less to prove. He was maybe 50, silver at the temples, built like he paid someone to keep him that way. He moved through the room with the particular territorial confidence of a man who considered himself the natural center of any space he occupied. Nathan watched him stop near 2 people from Victoria's team. He could tell by the Hale Capital lanyards, and engage them in what looked from across the room like friendly conversation. One of the staffers laughed. Whitmore touched the man's shoulder in the collegial way, the "we're all peers here" gesture. Nathan filed it without acting on it. Victoria's keynote was at 10. He found a seat near the aisle, 3rd row, where he could see her clearly and also see the room's reaction. She walked to the podium with a quality of movement he'd noticed before, not performing confidence, but actually having it, which read differently in a room full of people trained to spot the difference. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at 400 people for exactly 2 beats of silence, and then started talking. She was good. Not good in the polished, rehearsed way of a speaker who has practiced in front of a mirror until the humanity is gone. Good in the way of someone who actually believed what she was saying and had organized the belief into a coherent argument that happened to be well-structured. She talked about capital allocation in markets that financial institutions had historically written off as too volatile, too distant, too complicated. She used specific numbers. She named her failures, 2 investments that hadn't performed, one that had failed outright, with the same clear voice she used for the successes. She didn't hedge or qualify. She just told the truth as she understood it, and the room, which Nathan had assessed as restless and pre-networked and somewhat impatient, went genuinely quiet. He watched people stop typing on their laptops. That was the real tell. When a room full of conference attendees stopped looking at their screens, something was actually happening. During the applause at the end, he noticed Whitmore in the far right section, clapping with the minimal enthusiasm of someone performing the social requirement and nothing more. His face was doing the thing Nathan had seen on other men in other rooms, the controlled pleasantness that functioned as a mask for something less pleasant underneath. He wasn't certain what he was reading, he just noted it. The afternoon panel was where things got interesting. Victoria was moderating, which meant she was asking questions rather than answering them, and the four panelists included Derek Whitmore. Nathan had positioned himself near the back of the room for this one, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, watching the full stage picture rather than just Victoria. For the first 20 minutes, it was standard panel discourse, the kind where everyone is technically engaging with the questions but is actually advancing their own position. Whitmore was articulate and smooth, the kind of smooth that covered something sharp underneath, and twice he'd made points that were framed as complementary to Hale Capital's approach, while containing, embedded inside the framing, a structural criticism that would have been obvious to anyone paying close attention. Victoria caught both of them. But Nathan could tell by the way she let the first one pass with a redirect and the second one with a question that forced Whitmore to either clarify or reveal the criticism explicitly. He chose to clarify, which meant walking back to a safer position, which he did with practiced grace and visibly controlled irritation. Then, 40 minutes in, one of the audience members, a young analyst, maybe 28, earnest and slightly nervous the way people are when they're asking a question in a room full of their professional superiors, asked about Hale Capital's approach to currency risk in sub-Saharan markets. It was a genuine question, Nathan could tell. Whitmore answered it instead of Victoria. He did it smoothly, the kind of smooth that makes interruption feel like helpfulness. And what he said was technically accurate and also subtly, methodically designed to raise a question about Hale Capital's methodology without raising it explicitly. He used the word traditionally twice, which was doing a lot of work. He positioned Victoria's approach as innovative but untested, which was the kind of framing that sounds like a compliment and lands like a wound. The young analyst nodded, satisfied. The room absorbed it. Nathan watched Victoria. He watched her face process what had just happened. The recognition of it, the calculation of what responding would cost versus what absorbing it would cost. He watched her make the decision that the room's dynamics made the full response expensive, and he watched her file it with the particular contained frustration of a person who has made that calculus too many times. And then he stood up. He hadn't planned to. He was standing against the wall 30 feet from the nearest microphone, and he was a guest of Hale Capital, whose lanyard said guest and nothing else. And the room was full of people with decades of financial expertise and relevant credentials, and he had none of those things. He stood up. Whitmore saw him. Victoria saw him. The room gradually saw him. "Sorry," Nathan said, with the casual directness of someone who wasn't particularly sorry. "I think the question was for Ms. Hale." A beat of silence, the kind that fills with social calculation. Whitmore turned the smooth toward him. "I was just adding some context." "You were adding your context," Nathan said. "To her question." He looked at the young analyst. "Did you want her answer or his?" The analyst blinked, seemed to understand suddenly that something more was happening than he'd been aware of. Ms. Hale's." "Yes." He sat down. Whitmore's face did something brief and sharp that he recovered from in about half a second. The room was fully attentive now, which was its own kind of pressure, and Nathan felt it press on him from all sides. He also felt completely calm, which surprised him. He'd been in louder rooms. He'd been in rooms where the pressure was physical. This was just people. Victoria looked at him for one measured moment. Then she turned to the analyst. "Thank you for the question. Let me give you an actual answer." What she said for the next 4 minutes was precise and specific, and left nothing ambiguous about her methodology or her confidence in it. She used numbers the way a person who had actually done the work uses them, not as decoration, but as evidence. When she finished, the room gave her the particular quiet of people who have received more than they expected. Whitmore said nothing for the remainder of the panel. Afterward, in the corridor outside the main hall, Victoria found Nathan near the coffee station. That was a risk, she said. Yes. It could have gone badly. I know. She studied him. Why did you do it? He considered the honest answer, which was the only kind that seemed to work with her. Because I've watched people redirect your questions all month. You answer everything else, but when someone does that, you absorb it. You calculate. You decide it costs too much to respond. He paused. I didn't have anything to lose by standing up. You had the evening's arrangement to lose. You had this. She gestured vaguely at the space between them, the month, whatever it had become. Yes, he said, but that felt less important than what was happening in the room. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of processing, something more interior. Nathan. Yeah. That's either very good judgment or very poor professional self-interest. Might be both. She looked at him steadily. It was the right thing to do. He nodded. She seemed about to say something else, but Cassandra appeared at her elbow with a reminder about the sponsor dinner, and Victoria shifted back into the functional mode, and they moved in separate directions. He stood by the coffee station for another minute before following. He was thinking about Whitmore's face in the half-second before he recovered, the sharpness in it, the thing underneath the smooth. He filed it. Oh. The seventh event was smaller, a private dinner at someone's house. An actual house, which turned out to mean a lakefront property in Lincoln Park that was technically a house the way an aircraft carrier is technically a boat. 14 guests. The host was a man named Elliot Marsh, who had made his money in logistics and had the comfortable, slightly rumpled ease of someone for whom wealth had become so normalized it had stopped requiring performance. Elliot seated Nathan next to a woman named Renata Voss, who was 53, had opinions about everything, and apparently found Nathan fascinating in the way that people find things fascinating when they can't categorize them. So what is it exactly that you do? She asked, over the soup course. Hospitality, Nathan said. That tells me almost nothing. I know. She laughed. She had a good laugh, full and unguarded. How did you and Victoria meet? At an event. One of hers. One she hosted. Renata studied him with open assessment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone she'd selected for specific use, an appendage. She tilted her head. You don't look like an appendage. Thank you. It wasn't entirely a compliment, but she was still smiling. She doesn't bring people places. Not personal people. Business people, yes. Her entire world is business people. But you're not that. How do you know? Because you've been here an hour, and you haven't tried to give anyone a card, or mentioned a single fund, or asked Elliot about his Q3 figures. She looked at him steadily. In this room, that's notable. He didn't answer. Across the table, Victoria was deep in conversation with Elliot, and she had the quality of attention she reserved for the 4 people in her world she actually liked. The full version, not the managed version. It changed her face somewhat, made it less architectural. She trusts you, Renata said. It wasn't a question. We have a professional arrangement, Nathan said. Renata smiled into her soup. If you say so. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means Victoria Hale does not have dinner with people she doesn't trust. She set her spoon down neatly. And the way she watches the room for you when you're not next to her, that's not professional arrangement behavior. That's something else. Nathan said nothing. He was aware that his face was doing a thing it shouldn't, some version of acknowledging what he wasn't supposed to acknowledge, and he focused on neutralizing it. Renata let him off the hook with a pivot to the wine, and the conversation moved on. But after dinner, when the guests had dispersed into smaller clusters in Elliot's living room, and Nathan was standing near the window that faced the lake, Victoria appeared beside him with a glass of water and stood for a moment without talking. Renata liked you, she said finally. She was interesting. She's usually terrifying. She once made a CFO cry at a board meeting. Victoria looked out at the lake, which was dark and large and moving slowly. She said you were unexpectedly grounded. For Renata, that's practically a marriage proposal. He smiled. I'll put it on my resume. Under hospitality? Under operations. She looked at him sideways. There was something different in it tonight, something less managed. Maybe it was Elliot's house, which didn't have the charged, performance-grade energy of the bigger events. Maybe it was the wine, though he'd watched her drink maybe 4 sips all evening. Whatever it was, she seemed, slightly, to have stepped back from something. Nathan. She said his name the same way she always did, testing the weight of it. What happens when the month is over? He kept his voice even. I go back. To what? To catering, to Lily, to the things that were there before. And you're fine with that. It wasn't quite a question. He took his time with it. I'm fine with knowing where I stand. She turned toward the window, turned back. What if where you stand is less clear than that? He looked at her directly. Victoria. I'm not... She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly, tried again. I'm asking a professional question about post-arrangement parameters. No, you're not. She was quiet. I'm not going to answer a question you haven't actually asked, he said. When you figure out what you're actually asking, I'll give you an answer. Something crossed her face. Frustration, maybe, or the recognition of being seen. She looked like she was going to say something sharp and then decided against it. 2 more events, she said instead. 2 more events. He looked back at the lake. She didn't move away immediately. They stood there for a while, the sound of other conversations filling the room behind them, the water dark outside the glass. It was the closest they'd been to something without a name for it, and Nathan stood in it and felt, underneath the calm, the beginning of something he'd been careful not to feel. On the way home, he called his mother. She picked up on the second ring, because she always picked up on the second ring, because she was the kind of woman who believed that letting a phone ring too long was a form of rudeness. It's late, she said. I know, sorry, I just needed to talk. Is Lily okay? Lily's fine. She's asleep. He pressed his head back against the car seat. Ma, if you were doing something you'd told yourself was just one thing, and it started being something else, what would you do? She was quiet for a moment. What's her name? He laughed despite himself. I didn't say anything about it. Nathan, I've known you for 32 years. What's her name? He looked at the city going past the windows. Victoria, he said. His mother made a sound that contained significant information without being words. Then, is she good? She's complicated. They always say complicated. What I mean is she good? Does she do what she says she'll do? Does she treat people with respect when she doesn't have to? He thought about it. Yes, he said. Both. Then stop talking yourself out of it. Ma, it's a business arrangement. He stopped. She runs $1 billion company. I run catering shifts. I didn't ask what you do. I asked if she's good. His mother's voice was the patient, immovable kind. You've been alone for 5 years. Lily needs to see you happy, not performing happy, actually happy. He didn't answer. Nathan? Yeah. Go to sleep. You're tired. Things look different when you're tired. They don't, though. That's the problem. She made the sound again. Call me tomorrow. He said goodnight and sat with the phone in his hand. Marco drove and said nothing, which was exactly right. The city slid past outside, Chicago in the late fall, the particular quality of light from buildings caught in black water, the specific cold that came off the lake and pressed against the windows of moving cars. He'd lived here his whole life, and it still did this sometimes, still gave him a moment where it looked like a painting of itself. He thought about 2 more events. He thought about Renata Voss saying, that's something else with her spoon in her soup, and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has understood something before the people involved in it have. He thought about Victoria standing at a window saying, less clear than that, with the deliberate blankness of someone who had gotten very good at saying things without saying them. He told himself, for the 3rd or 4th time, to be careful. This time, he wasn't sure he believed it. The 8th event was supposed to be simple, a charity auction at the Drake Hotel, the kind of evening that existed primarily to allow wealthy people to feel generous while also being seen feeling generous, which was its own distinct social currency. Nathan had learned to read these events quickly. The bidding wasn't really about the items. The items were just the architecture around which the real conversations happened. Who sat next to whom who made eye contact across the room, who left early, and who stayed until the last lot. He'd been looking forward to it, which was something he hadn't expected to be able to say about any of these evenings 4 weeks ago. The anticipation sat in his chest like something uncomplicated, and he didn't examine it too hard. 2 days before the auction, his phone rang at 7 in the morning. He was making Lily's breakfast. Scrambled eggs, the way she liked them, which was slightly overdone and not particularly seasoned because she was 7 and had the palate of someone who distrusted flavor. And he almost let it go to voicemail until he saw the number. Not Cassandra, not Marco. An unknown number with a Chicago area code. He answered. "Is this Nathan Reed?" The voice was male, efficient, with the particular cadence of someone who asked questions for a living. "My name is Garrett Foley. I'm a journalist with the Tribune's business desk. I'm working on a piece about Victoria Hale, and I was hoping you'd be willing to talk." Nathan's hand stilled over the pan. The eggs continued cooking underneath it. "About what?" he said. "About your relationship with Ms. Hale. Your arrangement, specifically." A pause. "I have some information about the nature of your agreement. I'd like to give you the opportunity to comment before the piece runs." He kept his voice flat. "What piece?" "An examination of Ms. Hale's use of what I'd characterize as a managed public image strategy, which includes the arrangement she's made with you." Another pause. Designed. "I have documentation, Mr. Reed, copies of payment transfers, a summary of the terms. I just want to make sure I have your side of it." The eggs were burning. He moved the pan off the heat and stood very still in his kitchen. "I don't have a comment," he said. "Don't call this number again." He ended the call. Lily looked up from her spot at the table. She had his old tablet propped against the cereal box and had been watching something with animated horses, but she'd registered the tone shift the way kids always did, with the particular animal sensitivity of small people who depended on reading adult moods for their own safety. "Who was that?" she asked. "Work stuff." He scraped the eggs onto her plate. "Eat. You've got 10 minutes. She looked at the eggs. "They're brown. They're cooked." "They're brown, Daddy. They're cooked and brown. Eat them." She ate them with the tolerant martyrdom of a child who knew which battles she'd win, and Nathan stood at the kitchen counter with his back to her and thought carefully about what to do next. He texted Cassandra, "Need to speak with Victoria directly. Today if possible. It's urgent." The response came in 6 minutes. "She has a window at noon. I'll send an address." Oh, the address was a Hale Capital conference room, 16 floors up, with a view of the river that Nathan registered and then set aside as irrelevant. Victoria was already there when he arrived, not sitting, standing at the window with her phone in her hand, and the expression of someone who had already received news he was there to deliver. "Cassandra told me it was urgent," she said. "I got a call this morning." He told her about it directly, no setup, just the facts. Name, publication, what Foley had claimed to have, documentation, payment records, the terms. He watched her face while he talked. It was a controlled face. She'd spent years making it controlled. But something moved through it while he spoke. Not panic. Victoria Hale didn't appear to have an easy relationship with panic. More like the calculation of someone who has just had a significant variable introduced into a system they'd believed was closed. When he finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted. "He has payment record," she said. "That's what he said." "That's internal. Those aren't public documents." She turned from the window. "Someone from inside gave him those." "That's what I thought." She looked at him. "You believe him? That he has them?" "He gave me enough specifics to be credible. The structure of the payments, the timeline." Nathan held her gaze. He knew things that a journalist wouldn't guess at. Victoria set her phone down on the conference table and pressed both palms flat on the surface, looking at it for a moment. It was the most physically grounded he'd seen her. A posture that wasn't professional, just human, someone steadying themselves against a surface. "This is going to become a story," she said. "Whether it runs with my comment or without it, it becomes something." "Yes." "The framing will be—" She stopped, restarted. "The framing will be that I manufactured something. A relationship for public image management, which is technically accurate and contextually wrong. And by the time that distinction travels through a news cycle, it doesn't matter. No, Nathan said. It won't matter. She looked at him. He couldn't tell what she was looking for. Nathan, I understand what you need to do, he said. It came out steadier than he felt. You need to distance from me, publicly. Get ahead of the framing before he sets it. He kept his voice even, factual. That's the correct move for the company. She held his gaze for a long moment. You're telling me to do it. I'm telling you it's the logical move. I'm not telling you to do anything. That's a distinction without a difference. It's actually not. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. There's a difference between me understanding the situation clearly and me making it easy for you by pretending I don't. She sat down across from him. The conference room hummed with the building systems, the ventilation, the muted sounds of the city below. She looked for a moment like she was going to say something unmanaged and then thought better of it. I need 48 hours, she said finally, to figure out where the leak came from. Before I do anything public, I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with. Okay. The auction is in 2 days. I think you shouldn't come. It landed the way he'd known it would. Not dramatically. It was too logical for drama. It just landed like something solid settling into a position. Okay, he said again. Nathan. She said his name with a weight in it. This is not... She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again, and what came out was more carefully built than what she'd started with. The arrangement still stands, financially. You'll receive payment for the final event regardless. He looked at her. That's not what I'm thinking about. I know. She looked away. I know that. He stood up. Let me know what you find out about the source. I will. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door, he stopped. He didn't plan to stop. It just happened, the body making a decision before the mind finished the argument. For what it's worth, he said, without turning around, the arrangement stopped being the main thing a while ago. For me. Just so you know where I actually stand. He left before she could answer. He didn't let himself think about whether he'd made a mistake until he was in the elevator and the doors had closed, and there was nowhere for the thought to go except back into his chest, where it settled uncomfortably and stayed. The 48 hours were difficult. Not dramatically difficult, just the ordinary, grinding difficulty of knowing something is happening that you can't control and having to fill your hours with normal things while knowing it. He picked Lily up from school. He took a catering shift, a corporate lunch downtown, 3 hours, unremarkable, the kind of work that required enough of his body that it gave his mind somewhere to stand. He made dinner. He helped with a reading assignment that Lily was convinced was unfair because it used the word photosynthesis, which she felt was too advanced for second grade. You can say it, he said. It's too many syllables. Try. She tried and got it on the second attempt, and looked so shocked by her own success that he laughed, and for a moment the weight of the 48 hours lifted by about 20 pounds, and he was just a dad at a kitchen table helping with homework. Then she went to bed, and the weight came back. He'd meant what he said in the conference room. That was the problem. He'd meant it completely, without strategy, without the protection of ambiguity, and he'd said it out loud, which was the kind of thing you couldn't take back and couldn't unmean. He hadn't let himself think too hard about Victoria Hale for most of the month. He'd observed her. That was different. Observation was practical, professional. It served the function of knowing the room and being useful in it. But thinking about her, the actual interior act of it, he'd kept that at a careful distance. Renata Voss at the dinner table had seen what he'd been avoiding, and his mother had seen it on the phone, and he'd still managed to keep it theoretical. It stopped being theoretical in Elliot Marsh's house, standing at that window with the lake outside, when she'd said less clear than that with the careful voice of someone who was trying and failing to keep their feelings inside their professional vocabulary. He made coffee he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the fact that he was a 32-year-old single father with $400 in checking, a landlord whose patience was structural and not emotional, a 7-year-old who ate overdone scrambled eggs without complaint, and no business developing feelings for a woman who ran a billion-dollar company and was currently navigating a media threat he'd somehow become the center of. He thought about all of that clearly, organized, the way he organized practical problems. And then he thought about her standing at the conference table with her palms flat on the surface, steadying herself. And he thought, I want to fix this for her. Not because of the money, not because of the arrangement, just because something in him had organized itself. Over 8 events and several car rides and one conversation at a gallery window in front of a painting he couldn't remember anymore. Around the idea of her being okay. He went to bed at midnight and slept badly. Akab. She called at 9 the next morning. Not Cassandra, not a text. She called, which she'd never done directly, and he was awake and in the kitchen again, this time not making anything, just standing there with the coffee he hadn't finished the night before. I know where it came from, she said. Her voice was flat in the specific way of controlled anger. He'd heard the managed version of her irritation before, the contained, redirected kind she deployed in professional settings. This was something beneath that, something that hadn't been filtered. Tell me, he said. I had Cassandra go through the records. There are 3 people in my organization who had access to the payment structure of our arrangement. 2 of them have been with me for years. The third is an associate I brought on 8 months ago from... She stopped. From Whitmore Capital. Nathan said nothing for a moment. He planted someone, he said. It appears so. The associate transferred 2 weeks ago to a different team. I thought it was a routine request. Cassandra flagged the timing this morning. The request came 3 days after the conference. After the panel. After the panel. After Nathan had stood up and redirected the room. He did this because of what happened at the conference, Nathan said. He did this because I've been gaining ground in 3 markets he considers his territory, and the panel was an opportunity that I interrupted. Her voice was still flat, still that controlled anger underneath it. The panel was going to be his moment. I was supposed to absorb it the way I absorb things, and instead I stood up. Instead, you stood up. A pause. I'm not blaming you for that. I know. She stopped again, started differently. The story is still moving. Foley is still working on it. Even knowing where it came from, I can't prove Whitmore orchestrated it without more than I currently have. His fingerprints aren't on the leak. His employees are. What about the employee? She's already gone, resigned this morning, which is itself telling but not actionable. Nathan looked at the window above his kitchen sink. The morning was gray, early November trying to become winter. He thought about the map he'd been building all month. The room at the conference, Whitmore moving through it with that territorial ease, the handshakes with Victoria's staff, the smooth, unhurried quality of someone who had already placed his pieces before the game started. He's done this before, Nathan said. I believe so. I can't prove it. You don't need to prove it yet. He pulled out the chair and sat. What does Foley actually have, specifically? The payment records, a description of the arrangement, probably a characterization of it as image management. Does he have anything about... He chose the word carefully. Anything beyond the arrangement. Anything that looks like more than professional. Silence on the line. Brief. I don't know what he'd have that would indicate that, she said carefully. I'm not asking what Whitmore knows. I'm asking what Foley has. He kept his voice steady. Because if the story is just the arrangement, the payments, the events, that's manageable. It's unusual, but it's not a scandal. What makes it a scandal is if he can frame it as something personal being hidden. And if it is personal, she said, it doesn't need to be hidden to be damaging. There it was, said plainly, finally, without the professional vocabulary carrying the weight of it. He sat with it for a moment. Victoria. Don't. Her voice was controlled again, the filter back in place. Nathan, I need to manage this cleanly. And managing it cleanly means distancing from me publicly. Yes. Okay. Nathan. She said his name with something in it that she immediately compressed. I need you to understand that this decision is not about what I... She stopped, tried a third time and chose precision over honesty, which he'd learned was what she did when the honesty felt too exposed. This is a business decision. The company has 400 employees. Investor confidence is not abstract. I know, he said. You don't have to justify it to me. I understand. You're angry. I'm not angry. He wasn't, which was the part he found strange. I know what this is. I've known what this was every step of the way. I should have... He stopped himself. Didn't finish the sentence. The gallery event is still on? Yes. 1 week. I'll be there. Nathan, we agreed. One more event. His voice stayed even. I'll be there. We closed the arrangement properly. A long pause. Okay, she said quietly. He ended the call and set the phone on the table. He sat without moving for probably 3 minutes, which was longer than he generally allowed himself for something that wasn't productive. Then he stood, washed his coffee cup, and started making a list of what needed to happen before the gallery event. He wasn't angry. He knew that was the truth. He was something else, a specific sadness, flat and clear, the kind that comes not from surprise but from the confirmation of something you'd already halfway known. He told himself to be careful the whole month. He'd said it like a prayer, and then proceeded to not be careful at all. And now here was the entirely predictable outcome of that. And he had nobody to be angry at. Not really. Not Victoria. She was protecting what she'd built. He understood the arithmetic of that completely. Not himself, even. He'd known who he was and where he stood at every single point. He was just sad about it, in the ordinary, quiet way of adult sadness, which doesn't make sounds and doesn't require anything from anyone and just sits there in your chest while you wash dishes and sign permission slips and make plans. That afternoon, Cassandra sent a link without comment. He clicked it. It was a statement on Hale Capital's official communications page, timestamped 2 hours ago. Short. Victoria Hale confirming that she had attended several public events in recent weeks, accompanied by Mr. Nathan Reed, describing the arrangement as a professional one related to social navigation support, noting that the relationship was entirely professional in nature. Entirely professional in nature. He read it twice. Set his phone down, picked it up, and read it a third time. He understood why she'd said it. He understood every word of the calculation that had produced those words. He understood it the way he understood Gerald Fitch's apologetic firmness, the way he understood every practical decision made by practical people operating inside systems that didn't leave much room for the impractical. He understood it, and it still landed like a door closing. He texted his mother that he was fine. He picked up Lily from school. He watched her demonstrate with significant dramatic investment the fact that Dominique had eaten her cheddar crackers without asking and how this constituted a serious breach of the social contract. He said, "That sounds really unfair," and meant it for 2 reasons. Later, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the same stillness he'd brought to the hardest nights of the last 5 years. The nights when the money didn't add up, when Lily was sick and he was exhausted and there was nobody to tag in, when the city felt very large and his apartment felt very small. He'd learned to sit inside the hard thing without trying to immediately fix it or convert it into something useful. He thought about Whitmore. He thought about a man who had moved through the conference with that easy territorial confidence, who had placed someone inside Victoria's organization months before the panel, who had waited for exactly the right moment and then used a journalist to do the thing that couldn't be done directly. He thought about the elegance of it, which he found genuinely repellent, the kind of precision that had nothing to do with building something and everything to do with preventing someone else from building something. He thought about what he'd filed all month, the handshakes, the timing, the smooth, unhurried patience of someone who had already said his pieces. He opened the Notes app on his phone and began writing, not for any particular purpose, just organizing what he knew, the way he organized everything, practically, systematically, putting things in order. The conference, Whitmore's behavior before and during the panel, the timeline of the leaked documents relative to the panel, the associate who had transferred and then resigned, the journalist receiving specific internal documents that would require access or deliberate provision. He wrote it all down. And then he sat there looking at it and thought, this is a pattern. And then he thought, patterns can be shown to people. And then he thought about the gallery event, 1 week away. The last event. He put the phone down and turned off the kitchen light. He had 1 week. 1 week and one more evening in the same room as Derek Whitmore, and a month's worth of quiet observation. And the thing he'd always had when everything else was in short supply, the ability to read a room and know what was actually happening in it. He went to bed. He didn't sleep immediately. But when sleep came, it came solidly, settling over the hard thing without erasing it, the way sleep does for people who have learned to carry weight without putting it down. The week moved the way bad weeks do. Not quickly, not slowly, just with a particular grinding texture that made each day feel longer than its hours. Nathan worked 2 catering shifts, helped Lily with a school project about the water cycle that required cutting pictures from magazines, and produced more paper scraps than he'd have thought possible from a single assignment, and spent his evenings methodically building the thing he'd started in his notes app the night after Victoria's statement went public. He wasn't sure what he was building exactly. That was the honest answer. He had observations, a timeline, a pattern, but patterns weren't evidence, and evidence wasn't something he knew how to formalize. He wasn't a lawyer or an investigator. He was a man who read rooms for a living, who had spent a month reading a very specific set of rooms, and who had accumulated, without intending to, a detailed picture of how Derek Whitmore operated. He thought about what Victoria had said. I can't prove Whitmore orchestrated it without more than I currently have. His fingerprints aren't on the leak. The fingerprints were never going to be on the leak. That wasn't how a man like Whitmore worked. He was the kind of person who kept himself 2 steps removed from every action, who built plausible deniability the way other people built equity, steadily, deliberately, as a long-term strategy. The associate who'd transferred and resigned, the journalist who'd received documents from an internal source. Every connection was one person removed from Whitmore himself. But there was something Nathan kept coming back to. He knew what Whitmore had wanted from the conference panel. He'd watched it happen in real time, the setup, the redirect, the attempt to reframe Victoria's methodology as untested and her success as provisional. That hadn't been improvised. That had been prepared, which meant Whitmore had gone into the conference with specific goals, which meant the leak and the journalist had been part of a larger plan that started before the panel, not in response to it. Nathan wasn't a target originally. He was a variable that had become inconvenient, which meant Whitmore had been building towards something before Nathan was even in the picture. He wrote that down, added it to the notes, looked at the shape of what he had. Then he spent 2 evenings online reading carefully, looking at Whitmore Capital's public-facing history, press releases, financial publication profiles, a profile piece in a business magazine from 3 years ago that described Whitmore as aggressively acquisitive in markets where competitors have shown hesitation. He read Hale Capital coverage across the same period, mapped the geography of their respective investment focuses, noted 3 specific market segments where their interests overlapped. He wasn't finding evidence. He was finding context. Context, he was beginning to understand, was sometimes enough. Marco picked him up at 6:15 on the night of the gallery event. Nathan was ready at 6, which gave him 15 minutes to stand in his kitchen in the charcoal suite. Dario had pressed it, returned it with a note that simply said, "Good luck, though I don't think you'll need it," and have the particular internal conversation that happens before something you've been preparing for and dreading simultaneously. He thought about Lily, who was at his mother's tonight because it was Friday, and his mother liked having her on Fridays, took her to the farmer's market Saturday mornings, and let her pick out one thing she'd never eaten before and watch her either love it or make a face of profound betrayal. He thought about the fact that his rent was fully paid now, had been for 3 weeks, the first time in 8 months he'd looked at his bank account without the particular low-level nausea of a man doing arithmetic that didn't add up. He thought about how that had happened and what it had cost, and what it hadn't cost, and the complicated feeling of both of those things sitting in the same body at the same time. He thought about Victoria's statement, entirely professional in nature. He picked up his phone and looked at the notes. Everything he had was there, organized, coherent. It was enough to present to someone. Whether it was enough to matter was a different question and not one he could answer yet. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. Marco said, "Mr. Reed at the curb and nothing else for the 22 minutes to the gallery, which was on the near north side in a space Nathan didn't know. A converted industrial building, the second floor of it, the kind of venue that had exposed steel beams and poured concrete floors and lighting so specifically calibrated it made everything inside it look significant whether it was or not. He arrived before Victoria. He'd known he would. He used the time to walk the space. The gallery was showing work by 3 artists, large format photography, textile sculpture, and a series of paintings that Nathan didn't understand but found himself standing in front of for a while anyway. The crowd was maybe 80 people, smaller than the conference but more fluid, the kind of gathering where the social circulation happened in tighter loops. He recognized 4 faces from previous events and noted their positions. And there was Whitmore. Of course there was Whitmore. He was near the far end of the gallery, near the photography section, with a glass of wine and the wide stance posture of a man who never allowed himself to look like he was waiting. He had 2 people with him Nathan didn't know, and was talking at them with the energetic confidence of someone conducting his social obligations efficiently. Nathan positioned himself at an angle that wasn't obvious and watched him for 3 minutes. Whitmore was scanning the room, doing it the way professionals did. Not obviously, not with turning heads, just the slow peripheral sweep of someone who knew exactly where every relevant person was at all times. He was looking for Victoria, and then Nathan was looking for Garrett Foley. He found him 7 minutes later near the drinks table, not carrying a press badge because this wasn't a press event. He was dressed well enough to blend, dark jacket, no tie, the comfortable anonymity of someone who'd learned how to occupy a space without announcing his purpose. But he had his phone out, and he was looking at it the way people look when they're waiting for something specific. Nathan recognized him from the byline photo on his Tribune articles. He'd looked him up. He looked between Foley and Whitmore, 40 feet apart, not interacting, positioned on opposite sides of the room, which was itself a kind of coordination. The kind that required prior communication, prior agreement about where each person would stand and what each person would do. Foley wasn't here to cover an arts event. He was here because someone had told him to be here, had told him there would be something to see. Nathan thought about what that something might be intended to look like. He thought about it for the time it took him to cross to the drinks table and get a glass of water. And then Victoria arrived. She came in with Cassandra and a man Nathan hadn't met. Her legal counsel, he'd later understand, though he didn't know it at the time. She was in charcoal tonight, not the red of the private dinner, something more subdued and deliberate. She looked from 30 feet like someone who had made careful decisions about every visible thing. She saw Nathan. He watched her see him. The fractional change in her posture, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite its opposite. She said something to Cassandra and moved into the room. He let her work the first 30 minutes. He stayed on the periphery, monitoring. He watched Foley drift gradually closer to the center of the room, his phone still in his hand. He watched Whitmore finish his conversation and begin a new one with a man Nathan recognized from the conference, one of the panelists who'd been most complimentary of Whitmore's points. At 40 minutes in, Nathan walked to where Whitmore was standing. He did it calmly and without announcement, appeared at the edge of the conversation, nodded briefly to the man Whitmore was talking to, and looked at Whitmore directly. "Derek," he said, familiar, easy. Whitmore took exactly 1 second to reassemble his expression. "Nathan." His voice was smooth, untroubled, which was a choice he'd made in 1 second, which told Nathan something about how prepared he was for this. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight. I wouldn't miss it." Nathan glanced at the other man. "Could you give us a moment?" The other man looked at Whitmore, who gave a subtle nod that wasn't quite comfortable. The man made his exit toward the drinks table. Nathan turned back to Whitmore. He kept his voice conversational, not low, not aggressive. Just 2 men having a perfectly ordinary exchange at a gallery event. "I wanted to talk to you about Mara Elston," Nathan said. Something moved through Whitmore's face and was gone. Mara Elston was the associate who had transferred and resigned. Nathan had found her name in a trade publication mentioned from 8 months ago, when she'd been listed as joining Hale Capital's emerging markets team. Former Whitmore Capital employee. "I don't know what you think." "I don't think anything," Nathan said. "I know that Mara Elston transferred from Whitmore Capital to Hale Capital 8 months ago. I know she requested a team change 3 days after the conference panel and resigned 6 days after that. I know that the documents Garrett Foley received, the man near the drinks table, by the way, you should know he's visible from about half this room. I know those documents required internal access that Mara had and that you had a channel to." Whitmore's face was doing an impressive job of staying neutral. His jaw had tightened. "That's an interesting story." "It's not a story, it's a timeline." Nathan kept his voice the same, even, conversational, Not a confrontation, just a description of facts. Here's the part that's more complicated. I've been reading about your capital activity over the past 3 years. You and Victoria are competing in 3 overlapping markets. 2 of them, she's outperforming you. The third one, sub-Saharan infrastructure bonds, which is what that analyst asked about at the conference, she's about to enter in a meaningful way and you're already positioned there. If her methodology gets publicly questioned before she completes that entry, it changes the calculus for at least 2 significant institutional investors. Whitmore said nothing. Patricia Drummond, Nathan said, who told Victoria she was unusually unambitious at one of our earlier events. And James Calloway, who I noticed talking to you for about 20 minutes at the conference before the panel. Both of them are significant investors in the sub-Saharan space. He paused. A story in the Tribune about manufactured image management, right before Victoria makes that market entry, would give both of them a reason to hesitate. You're speculating, Whitmore said. His voice had lost some of its smoothness. I'm connecting publicly available information into a coherent timeline. Nathan tilted his head slightly. Now, here's what I'm actually telling you. I have this written down. All of it. The timeline, the overlap, Mara Elston's movement, the conference positioning, Foley's presence tonight. I haven't given it to anyone yet. Whitmore looked at him with the reassessing expression of a man recalibrating what he's dealing with. You're a caterer, he said. Not cruelly, just factually, as if reminding himself of something he'd filed incorrectly. Yes, Nathan said. And I spent a month watching people in rooms who thought I was invisible. He held Whitmore's gaze. That's a lot of information. A long pause. The gallery moved around them. Conversation, footsteps on concrete, the ambient sounds of people performing enjoyment of art. Neither of them moved. What do you want? Whitmore said finally. For Foley to leave tonight without a story, Nathan said. That's all. And if he does? Then the timeline stays in my notes app and I go home. And Victoria? Nathan looked at him steadily. Victoria didn't ask me to do this. She doesn't know I'm having this conversation. He let that sit for a moment. This is me, personally, being unwilling to watch someone get taken apart by a scheme she didn't build. Something worked through Whitmore's expression. Reassessment again. A more fundamental version of it, like a man who had mapped a terrain carefully and is now discovering there was a feature he hadn't charted. He looked at Nathan with the kind of attention he probably reserved for things that surprised him, which Nathan suspected wasn't a large category. You're protecting her, Whitmore said. I'm correcting a situation, Nathan said. Those aren't the same thing. Whitmore set his wineglass down on the nearby surface. He straightened his jacket with the unconscious adjustment of a man resetting himself. He looked across the room to where Foley was standing, then back at Nathan. The story has complications, he said carefully. Foley may find it less viable than he anticipated. That would be good news, Nathan said. He stepped back, a clear and unhurried exit from the conversation, and moved toward the photography section without looking back. His heart was going at about twice its normal rate, which he'd been keeping out of his body language for the past 4 minutes through the sheer practiced effort of someone who had learned, young, that showing pressure in your face and posture was a different kind of cost than feeling it. He stood in front of a large format photograph, a cityscape taken from below, looking up at towers, the angle making them lean toward each other across the frame, and breathed slowly and let his heart do what it needed to do. 8 minutes later, across the room, he watched Garrett Foley check his phone, finish his drink, and leave. He found an empty corridor off the main gallery space, a connecting hallway between the main room and a secondary exhibition space that wasn't in use tonight. He stood there for a moment with his back against the wall, just being still, the sounds of the event muffled but present. Nathan. He turned. Victoria was standing at the entrance to the corridor, her expression doing something he couldn't immediately classify. How long have you been standing there? He asked. Long enough. She walked toward him, stopped about 4 feet away. She was looking at him with a focused, unguarded attention that was different from the managed version. I saw you talking to Whitmore. Yes. And then I saw Foley leave. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. What did you say to him? He told her. Not the whole thing, just the shape of it, the timeline he'd built, the pressure point he'd identified, the exchange. He kept it factual, no editorializing. When he finished, she was still looking at him with that unguarded quality. "You did that without telling me," she said. "Yes." "Nathan, that was—" She stopped. If it had gone wrong, he could have written a worse story. He could have added your confrontation to it. "I know. That was a significant risk." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "I made a judgment call. I'm not going to pretend I was certain it would work." "Why?" She said it plainly, no framing around it. "After the statement I put out, after—" She stopped. "Why would you—" "Because it was the right thing to do." He said it simply, the same thing he'd said to Whitmore. "And because I've spent this whole month watching you manage things alone. Everything alone, every room, every calculation, every decision about what to protect and what to sacrifice." He kept his voice even, not heated. "You shouldn't have had to handle this one alone, too." She looked at him for a long time. Her composure was intact, but there was something behind it that wasn't, something that had been sitting behind it for a while and was pressing forward. "The statement," she said. "I need you to know, Victoria." He said her name gently. "I understood the statement. I don't think you understood all of it. I understood that you were protecting the company. I understood the logic. That's not—" She pressed her lips together. Tried again. "That's not all of what it was." She looked at the hallway wall for a moment, then back at him. "The statement was accurate and also—" She stopped, and he watched her do the thing he'd seen her do at Elliot's house, and on the phone, and at the conference table. Try to say a true thing inside her professional vocabulary and find that the vocabulary wasn't big enough for it. "I was frightened," she said finally. "Not of the story, of what the story was about." Which was that it wasn't— She exhaled. "That it was no longer professional in nature and hadn't been for some time, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I—" She looked at him directly. "I named it what I needed it to be instead of what it was." The gallery sounds moved through the wall between them. Someone laughed, somewhere in the main room. A cluster of footsteps, then quiet again. Nathan said carefully, "What was it?" She looked at him with an expression he'd first seen at the blue and ochre painting, the one he couldn't remember anymore, when her face had done something briefly unmanaged. He recognized it now for what it had been. The expression of someone who could account for every variable in a complex system and had just discovered a variable that didn't behave the way variables were supposed to. "Something I didn't plan," she said, "which is not a category I'm comfortable in." "I know. I've been running this company for 6 years. I built it from an investment of $400,000 in a sublet office with 2 employees. She said it not as a boast, but as context. Every decision I've made has been calculated. Every relationship has had a defined structure, a defined purpose. I know what every person in my professional life wants from me, and I know exactly how much of myself I can afford to give them." She paused. "And then you walked into my event and called me baby on accident and told me about your landlord without flinching, and I—" Another pause. "I couldn't figure out what you wanted from me, and I kept waiting to figure it out. And you kept—" She made a small gesture, incomplete, that he understood anyway. "Not wanting anything. And I didn't know what to do with that." "Victoria," he said. I know I'm saying this badly. You're saying it fine." He took a step toward her, not closing the distance entirely, just reducing it. "I'm not going to tell you I handled this perfectly either. I told myself to be careful about 16 times, and then wasn't careful at all." Something in her face broke open slightly, and she laughed. A short, real, uncontrolled laugh that surprised both of them. It lasted about 2 seconds and left something softer in its wake. "Careful," she repeated. "I told myself it was a professional arrangement." "I told myself the same thing." "We were both wrong." "We were both wrong," he agreed. She looked at him steadily. "The arrangement ends tonight," she said. "Officially, the final event." "Yes. After tonight, there's no contract, no professional structure." "No." "Which means," she held his gaze, which means whatever happens next is something else entirely. He looked at her in the corridor of a gallery on a Friday night in November, with the sounds of other people's conversations moving through the wall and the city doing its city things outside, and thought about how different this was from the penthouse a month ago. He'd been holding a tray. He'd been counting hours until payment. He'd been a man in borrowed feeling clothes trying to be invisible. He wasn't any of those things anymore. Not because the money situation had changed, though it had, and not because of anything the past month had given him externally, but because something in him had been steadily organizing itself around something worth organizing around, and you could feel it when that happened. In your posture, in the quality of the decisions you made, in the way you stood in a room. "The last event ends at 9, he said. She glanced at her watch. "It's 8:43. So we have 17 minutes of professional arrangement left." "Approximately." He held her gaze. "And after that?" "After that," she said carefully, "someone might suggest dinner." "Someone might," he said. "Somewhere simple. No investors. No cameras. No contracts. No expectations." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That sounds different from everything else. That's the point." She looked at him with the full version of her attention. Not the managed version, not the professional version, the one he'd caught in glimpses all month and had understood was the real thing underneath all the other things. It was a look that didn't ask for anything or offer anything calculated. It just looked. 17 minutes, she said. 17 minutes. They walked back into the gallery together, and Nathan moved through the remaining time of the final event with the particular clarity of a man who knows he's in the last chapter of one thing and the first page of another. He talked to 3 people he'd met across the month. Dr. Osei, who was there and told him she'd cited his unusually unambitious description in a talk she was giving. Elliot Marsh, who shook his hand with the warm grip of a man who liked him and wasn't going to explain why. A young woman he didn't know who turned out to be one of Victoria's junior analysts, and who looked at him with the curious assessment of someone trying to understand his classification. He didn't try to classify himself. He just moved through the room and was present in it. At 9:12, Cassandra gathered the logistics of the evening's end, and the professional apparatus of Hale Capital began its efficient shutdown of the event. Nathan collected his jacket from the coat check, and he was standing near the gallery's main entrance when Victoria appeared beside him, with her coat in her hand and a look on her face that was direct and slightly uncertain in a way that was, on her, almost entirely new. "The car is available," she said. Cassandra offered. "For where?" She considered. "There's a place on North Clark. It's not impressive. They have good pasta and the lighting is reasonable, and it's the kind of place where nobody is there to be seen." He thought about pasta on Tuesdays, about Lily at the kitchen table saying that's selfish about a suit, about his mother saying stop talking yourself out of it, and the fact that his mother was almost always right. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They walked out of the gallery into the November air, which was cold and clear and smelled like the city, the particular mixture of lake wind and exhaust, and the specific urban cold that Nathan had been breathing his whole life. The street was lit the way Chicago streets were lit at this hour, with the unromantic practicality of a city that was still working, still moving, still doing what it did without stopping to be picturesque about it. He wasn't thinking about the month behind them, or the arrangement that had just officially ended, or the complicated architecture of everything that had led to this exact moment on this exact sidewalk. He was thinking about the restaurant on North Clark that Victoria had described as not impressive, and the good pasta, and the reasonable lighting, and the fact that they were going there with no investors and no cameras and no contracts. He was thinking that it felt already like something real. The restaurant on North Clark was called Bellows, and it was exactly what Victoria had described. Not impressive, which was to say it was real in all the ways the past month's venues had not been. The tables were wood, the kind that had been wiped down so many times the grain had smoothed out in the middle. The lighting was warm but not designed, not calibrated by someone whose job was making things look significant. The host was a heavy-set man in his 60s who seated them without recognizing Victoria, which Nathan understood was the entire point. The menu was laminated. The pasta options were listed in a font that had probably come with the printer. They sat across from each other without the social architecture of an event around them. No other guest to navigate. No professional purpose the evening was organized around. No arrangement structuring what they were to each other. Just two people at a table in a restaurant on a Friday night in November, which was the most ordinary thing Nathan had done in a month, and felt, because of everything that had preceded it, like a radical act. The waiter came. They ordered without consulting each other about what to get, which was itself a kind of intimacy, the assumption that you could make your own choice without performing deliberation. Victoria ordered the cacio e pepe. Nathan ordered the bolognese, and then immediately second-guessed it based on nothing rational, and then decided to leave it. "You second-guessed the pasta," Victoria said. "I didn't say anything." "You made a face." "I didn't make a face." "Nathan, you made a face." There was something in her voice that was lighter than he'd heard it. Not the almost smile she'd deployed all month, not the managed version, something that had less work behind it. "What was wrong with the bolognese?" "Nothing. Lily always says I order wrong." 7-year-olds are famously good at restaurant criticism. "She once told me a burger was too assembled. I don't know what that means. I've never known what that means." Victoria laughed. The real one. The same laugh that had appeared in the corridor and lasted 2 seconds and left something softer in its wake. This time it lasted longer. "Too assembled," she repeated. "She has opinions. I don't know where she gets them. Not from me. I'll eat whatever's in front of me." He settled back in his chair. Definitely not from her mother. He said it simply, without the careful, neutral tone he usually applied to any mention of that subject. The month had done something to his defenses. Not removed them, just made them less automatic. Victoria looked at him. "Do you think about her? Lily's mother?" "Not the way I used to." He was honest about it. "In the beginning, yeah. There was a lot of anger in there that I had to work through. She left when Lily was 4 months old, said she wasn't built for it." He turned his water glass in a slow circle, which turned out to be true. "She knew something about herself that I was still figuring out. I stopped being angry about it somewhere around Lily's 3rd birthday, and now it's just a fact, like weather." "Like weather," Victoria said, not as a question. "It happened. It shaped things. It's not happening anymore." He looked at her. "You get to a point where you stop building your life around the wound." She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. Other tables, low conversation, the clatter from the kitchen. "I wasn't built for it either," she said. "Relationships. I used to tell myself that was just the cost of building something serious, that you couldn't have both. And I'd chosen this. And there was nothing to mourn about that because it was the right choice." She looked at the table. "I got very good at believing that." Past tense. She looked up. Past tense. The food came. They ate, and it was the kind of meal where the food is genuinely good, but the eating is secondary, where what's happening is the conversation, and the food is just the structure that gives the conversation permission to be slow and unhurried. He told her about the first time he'd been alone with Lily, really alone, not in the hospital with nurses nearby, but home alone, first night, with a 4-month-old and no one coming to relieve him, the particular quality of that silence after the door closed on the last person who'd come to help. "I'd never been more terrified in my life," he said. "I didn't know how to bathe her correctly. I'd practiced on a doll at a class, and it was nothing like the actual thing, because the doll didn't move and didn't cry and didn't feel like someone fragile who needed to be kept alive." He paused. "I just sat on the bathroom floor with her wrapped in a towel afterward and thought, okay, this is it now. This is the whole thing, and either I'm capable of it or I'm not, and sitting on the floor won't help me figure out which, so I need to stand up." "And you stood up," Victoria said. "Eventually." He looked at her. "I dropped the towel getting up and she rolled a little and I thought I'd broken something and I hadn't. She was fine. She just looked at me with this expression like, 'Are you serious right now?' 7 years later, she still makes that face." Victoria smiled. Not the managed version, the actual one. "I want to meet her," she said. It came out before she'd finished deciding to say it, which he could tell by the slight change in her expression after the brief awareness of having said an unvetted thing. She didn't take it back. "She'll tell you your clothes are good," Nathan said. "She has strong opinions about fabric. I don't know where that came from either. And she'll interrogate me." Thoroughly. She once asked my neighbor's boyfriend what his credit score was. She'd heard me talking on the phone about mine and decided it was a relevant metric for evaluating adults. What did he say? He left. They broke up 2 weeks later for unrelated reasons, but Lily considers herself responsible and she's not entirely wrong. Victoria laughed again, and this time she didn't stop quickly. It moved through her and settled, and she looked across the table with an expression that was simply open, simply present, without calculation or management. He'd been watching her manage herself for a month, and he knew the difference. This was the unmanaged version, the one he'd caught in glimpses at windows and in corridors, and it looked like someone who had put something heavy down. He understood, watching her, what it had cost to get here. Not the professional cost, the internal one. The cost of being a person who had organized their whole self around control and competence, and the safe walls of defined structures, and choosing, incrementally, to stand somewhere those walls didn't reach. That wasn't a small thing. He knew because he'd done his own version of it. They stayed at Bellows until 10:50, which was nearly 2 hours, which was the longest Nathan had sat at a table without a professional purpose, and longer than he could accurately remember. They talked about her company, not the managed version she presented at events, but the actual thing. The early years, the specific fear of the first major investor meeting she'd almost canceled because she'd gotten the numbers wrong on a secondary projection and only caught it at midnight the night before and spent 5 hours correcting it alone in her office. She told him about the colleague who'd betrayed a confidence in her second year and the 2 years it had taken her to trust anyone inside her professional circle after that. She told him about the 3 companies she'd chosen not to acquire that everyone around her said she should have, and why she'd been right 2 times out of 3 and wrong, once in a way that still bothered her, not because of the money, but because she'd let someone else's conviction override her own judgment. He told her about the culinary management program he hadn't finished, not just the fact of it, but the feeling of it, the specific grief of stopping something he'd been good at because the circumstances required it, and how he'd never been entirely sure whether he'd made the right choice or just the only available one, and how at some point those became the same thing anyway. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The program?" "No," he said it without hesitation. "Lily exists because I was in that chapter. If I'd graduated and moved to New York like I was planning, she doesn't exist. So no." He paused. "I regret some of the intermediate steps, some of the years, not the destination. The destination being a single father doing catering shifts. The destination being someone who knows exactly what he values." He met her eyes. "The catering shifts are temporary." She looked at him steadily. "What comes after them?" "I don't know yet." It was honest, and he was okay with the honesty of it. "The program I was in had a management track. There are ways back into it. Not the same program, but equivalent. I've been looking at options." He paused. "I didn't tell you that." "You haven't mentioned it, no. Because I wasn't sure what it would sound like, whether it would seem like—" he searched for the right word, "like I was trying to close a gap that doesn't need to be closed." She set her fork down. "Nathan, I know. I've never once looked at you and thought about a gap. I know that now. I need you to know it all the way," she said. "Not just intellectually, all the way." She held his gaze with the same directness she brought to everything, unsparing, honest, the quality of attention that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her. "The people in my world spend enormous amounts of energy signaling their value. The watches, the cars, the correct opinions at the correct moments. And none of it, not one piece of it, has ever told me anything true about who they are." She paused. "You walked into my event holding a tray, and you've told me more true things in 1 month than most people in my professional life have told me in years." He absorbed that. Let it sit without immediately deflecting it, which was his instinct. The modesty that was sometimes genuine and sometimes a way of not receiving something that felt too large. "That's a lot to live up to," he said finally. "I'm not asking you to live up to anything. I'm asking you to keep doing the thing you already do." She picked her fork back up, which is apparently being inconveniently honest at every available opportunity, including with billionaire CEOs at their own events. Especially then. He smiled. She smiled. The restaurant was quieter now. The Friday night crowd had thinned and the tables around them had turned over, and the ambient noise had dropped to something that felt almost private. "The Whitmore situation," Nathan said. "It's not over." "I know. He'll find another angle. Men like that don't stop because one approach failed." He kept his voice even, not alarming, just honest. "You need to document what you have. Not for a lawsuit necessarily, just have it organized. The timeline, Mara Elston's movement, the overlap in markets. Have your legal team aware of the pattern. I'm meeting with them Monday." "Good. I have a better picture of his strategy now." She tilted her head. "Because someone spent a month quietly paying attention." "Habit," he said. "You learn to watch rooms when you spend enough time being invisible in them." She looked at him. "You were never invisible." "I know that now, too." The check came. Nathan reached for it, and Victoria put her hand on his arm. Not aggressively, just a plain, direct placement that stopped him. "Don't," she said. "Victoria." "Nathan." The word had something in it. Not firmness exactly. More the directness of someone who'd decided something and wasn't going to relitigate it. "Let me do this one uncomplicated thing." He leaned back. She paid. He let her, which was its own kind of choice. The choice of a man secure enough to receive something without it threatening anything. They walked out onto North Clark at 11:10 into the cold that had gotten sharper, the Lake Michigan variety that cut clean through anything you were wearing and made the city feel specific and physical. Their breath was visible. The street was quieter than it had been when they'd arrived, the Friday night crowd thinning toward that particular hour when the city is neither out nor home. "Marco's not here," Nathan said. "I told Cassandra to stand down for the evening." She said it with the slight, over-careful precision of someone who had made the decision and was aware it was a signal. He looked at her. "How far is your place from here?" "About 12 blocks. "I'll walk you." She looked at him for a beat. "It's cold." "Yes." "You're going to walk 12 blocks in November to walk me to my door and then take a cab home." "Yes." She looked at him for another beat. Something in her face settled, not into ease exactly, but into the specific quality of a person accepting something they'd been holding at a slight distance. "Okay," she said. They walked. The 12 blocks took them through the particular neighborhood texture of the near North Side at night, residential stretches and small commercial strips, the occasional bar still lit and occupied, the old buildings with their Chicago brick that looked different under the November sky than it did in daylight. They walked close, but not touching, which was its own thing. The specific charged proximity of two people who have made a decision but haven't moved all the way into it yet. She told him about the building she lived in, a condo she'd bought 6 years ago in the first year the company was profitable, which she'd done as a deliberate act of confidence rather than prudence, because she'd understood even then that the way you treated your own success told you something about whether you expected it to continue. "Did you expect it to continue?" he asked. "I expected to work until it did," she said. "Which isn't the same thing, but it has the same effect. Oh, that's an important distinction." "Most important things are distinctions." She glanced at him sideways. "You make them too. You just use simpler language for them." "I use the language I have. It's good language." They walked a block in the comfortable quiet of people who have been talking for 2 hours and don't feel the need to fill every silence. He thought about how rare that was. The silence that doesn't have anxiety in it. The silence that's just two people occupying the same space without the pressure of performance. He thought about the month behind them, the freight elevator and Gerald Fitch's voicemail, and the word that had come out wrong and started everything. The progression of rooms. Penthouse to dinner to conference to gallery. The slow accumulation of an understanding he hadn't been trying to build. The particular education of watching a powerful woman navigate a world that was simultaneously hers and not hers, that she'd built and still had to justify, that rewarded her and resented her in approximately equal measure and expected her to find both acceptable. He thought about Lily, at his mother's, asleep in the small bedroom that still had the dinosaur mobile from when Nathan was a kid, and how he'd call in the morning and she'd answer with the specific energy of a child who has been awake for 20 minutes and has already formed opinions about the day, and he'd listen to whatever she decided was important, and it would be the best part of the morning. He thought about how both of those things, this woman walking beside him, that kid asleep 12 miles away, could be true at the same time. How they didn't compete with each other, how his capacity for one didn't diminish his capacity for the other, and how he'd had to learn that, because for a long time he'd believed love was a fixed resource that had to be allocated carefully. It wasn't. That was the thing he'd learned the hard way. It wasn't fixed. It expanded with the people who called it out of you. "What are you thinking?" Victoria asked. "About capacity," he said. "Explain." "I spent a long time believing I only had so much of myself to give, that being a good father meant not having room for anything else. Not as a martyr thing, just as math." He looked at the street ahead of them. "And then this month happened, and I kept waiting to feel the trade-off. Kept waiting to feel like time with you was time taken from something else. And it wasn't. It never felt like that." He glanced at her, "which told me something." She was quiet for half a block. "What did it tell you?" "That I'd been doing the math wrong." She didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, quiet and careful, like someone handling something real. "I've been doing my own wrong math," she said. "Mine was, I told myself connection was a liability, that needing people cost you in ways you couldn't afford when you were building something." She paused. "I'm not sure when I started believing that. Early. I built the whole company on it as a premise. And now?" She looked straight ahead. "And now I've spent a month with someone who has needed people, really needed them, financially, practically, in every concrete way, and has somehow come out of it more intact than anyone I know." She paused. "Which suggests the premise was wrong." He thought about Gerald Fitch's apologetic firmness and Mrs. Ibarra's patient texts, and his mother picking up on the second ring and Lily's face when he came home. He thought about all the ways he'd needed people, and all the ways that had cost him, and all the ways it had also, undeniably, held him together. "Needing people isn't the vulnerability," he said. "Needing the wrong things from them is." She turned to look at him. The wrong things. Status, validation, someone to make you feel like your choices were correct. He kept his voice even. "I needed money practically this month. That's a clean need. It has a number. It has a solution. But what I ended up with was something else entirely, and it wasn't because I went looking for it. It was because you didn't want anything from me except—" He stopped, found the right word. "Presence. Just for me to be there and be real." She looked at him for a long moment. "That was a more accurate description of what I wanted than I gave you at the time." "I know. I told you it was professional navigation support." "You did." "That was—" She almost smiled. "An incomplete description." Significantly. They'd slowed down without either of them marking it. The walk had contracted, the blocks going by less quickly. Nathan registered it without changing his pace because the slowness felt right. "When you tell Lily about this," Victoria said, "how do you explain it?" The question caught him slightly, not unpleasantly, just with the warm surprise of something he hadn't expected. "When I tell Lily." "You will, eventually. She'll ask how we met." She said we with a matter-of-factness that landed quietly in his chest. 7-year-olds ask how people met. It's a category of information they consider important. He thought about it. "I'll tell her I was working, and I said the wrong thing to the wrong person, and the wrong person turned out to be the right one." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's a good story." "It's the true one." She looked at him. Something was moving through her face. Not the managed version, not the professional version, not even the almost smile. Something fuller, something that had been waiting behind all of it for a while, and was finally, in the cold on North Clark with nobody watching, stepping forward. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to not be diplomatic about it." "I'm never diplomatic." "I know. That's why I'm telling you." She stopped walking. They were a half block from a building he guessed was hers, and she'd stopped on the sidewalk and turned to face him. And the city was doing its city things around them, and she was looking at him with the unsparing directness he'd come to understand was the truest version of her. "I've been careful my entire adult life. Every decision, every relationship, every risk, calculated and controlled and managed within parameters I set for myself. And I'm good at it. I know I'm good at it. She paused. But I have been lonely in a way that I convinced myself was fine. That was just the shape of the life I'd chosen. He didn't say anything. He let her have the sentence. And then 1 month with someone who didn't want anything managed or controlled. She stopped. Her composure was intact, but something behind it wasn't. The same something that had been pressing forward all evening, given more ground now. I don't want to go back to the version where it's fine, she said. I'm not interested in that version anymore. The cold was real and present, and the street was quiet, and he was standing in front of a woman who had just said a true thing at considerable personal cost, which he understood because he'd been doing the same thing all month, because honesty wasn't cheap, and it wasn't always safe, and they'd both been paying its price steadily for 30 days. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, her cold fingers in his cold fingers, a simple and complete gesture that didn't require any framing. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. Not fine, he said. That's a reasonable thing to want. She pressed her lips together briefly. Her eyes were bright in the streetlight. She nodded once, small and real. They stood there on the sidewalk for a moment that had no professional structure around it, and no contract underneath it, and no arrangement defining its terms. Just two people in the November cold, holding hands in the ordinary, remarkable way of people who have decided to be in each other's lives. Walk me to the door, she said. Yes. He took a cab home at 11:45. He sat in the back seat and looked at the city going past and felt the difference between this cab ride and all the previous ones. The ones home from events with the particular weight of something managed and complicated sitting in his chest. This one was different. This one felt clean in a way he hadn't anticipated, as if a pressure he'd been carrying without fully noticing had been released all at once. He called his mother. He knew she'd be awake. She always was, late, with her television on low and her reading glasses on her head, the specific vigil of a woman who didn't sleep soundly until she knew her people were home. She picked up on the second ring. It's almost midnight, she said. I know, sorry. Is Lily okay? Lily's fine. She's asleep in the dinosaur room. He leaned his head back against the seat. Ma, you were right. A pause. The specific kind that contains satisfaction. About what specifically? About stopping talking myself out of it. Another pause. Longer. The name was Victoria. Yes. And you're calling me at midnight. Yes. His mother made the sound. The one that wasn't words. Then, tell me. He told her. Not everything, just the shape of it. The gallery, the restaurant, the walk. The things she'd said on the sidewalk about not wanting the version where it was fine. His mother listened the way she always listened to things that mattered, completely, without interjecting, with the patience of someone who understood that the story needed to unspool at its own pace. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone who worked hard for things, his mother said finally. She did. And she's not easy. No, he said. She's not easy. Good. His mother said it with the flat conviction of a woman who had seen enough of easy to know its limits. Easy doesn't last. Hard-won things last. A pause. Nathan. Yeah. Your father was not an easy man. She said it simply, which was how she always said things about his father, who had been gone for 11 years and whose absence was a specific shape in the family. And I chose him on purpose, with my eyes open, knowing it would require something from me. She paused. The things that require something from you are the ones worth having. He looked out the window at the city. I know, Ma. Lily is going to love her, she said. She'll interrogate her first, then she'll love her. I know. Make sure she interrogates her. Don't preempt it. It's important. He laughed. I won't preempt it. Good. Go home. Sleep. She paused. I'm glad, Nathan. I'm really glad. He said goodnight. The cab stopped in front of his building. He paid, got out, stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the door he'd walked through 10,000 times, in every version of himself he'd been across the years he'd lived here. He looked up. The building was ordinary. Brick, 6 stories, the kind of Chicago building that existed because it had to, and not because anyone had made decisions about it. His window was dark on the 4th floor. He'd get 4 hours of sleep before Lily's internal alarm system woke her at 7, regardless of what he intended. He let himself in. He didn't stand in the kitchen tonight. He went directly to bed, set his alarm, and lay in the dark with the particular quality of a man who is not anxious about what's coming. He thought about a woman who had said, "I don't want to go back to the version where it's fine," and how those words had cost her something to say, and how he'd received them. He thought about Lily at his mother's, sleeping with her mouth open the way she always did, one arm over the edge. He thought about the month, all of it, from the freight elevator to the borrowed suit, to the conference room, to the gallery corridor, to the cold sidewalk. The specific, unrepeatable sequence of events that had to happen in exactly the order they happened to produce this particular night. He thought about what you couldn't plan for. That was the truth underneath all of it. He'd spent 5 years planning, obsessively, practically, with the narrow focus of a man who couldn't afford to be surprised. Budget plans, backup plans, contingency plans. And all the planning was necessary, and none of the planning had produced anything that mattered as much as a single accidental word in a penthouse at 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. Baby. Wrong word, wrong woman, right moment. You couldn't plan for the thing that changed your life. You could only be ready enough when it arrived. Honest enough, open enough, steady enough not to run from it when the steadiness got hard. That was what the planning was actually for. Not to prevent surprise, but to be capable of receiving it. He'd been capable of receiving it. So had she. That was the whole story. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Nathan drove Lily to his mother's house for the farmer's market, and then kept driving to a coffee shop on the east side, where Victoria was waiting at a corner table with 2 coffees and the specific slightly compressed look of a person who has been waiting long enough to develop opinions about it. "You're 8 minutes late," she said when he sat down. There was a conversation about whether Lily's boots were the right boots. Were they? She decided yes, eventually. It took 8 minutes. Victoria pushed one of the coffees toward him. She was in the kind of Saturday clothes that looked like a decision. Dark jeans, a soft gray pullover, her hair loose in a way he'd only seen a few times. She looked like herself in the specific way of a person who has stopped maintaining the gap between the public and private versions. They'd had 5 non-arranged evenings in 3 weeks. 2 dinners, one afternoon at the Art Institute, where Victoria had opinions about every painting and didn't keep them quiet. One evening at his apartment, where she'd sat on his couch and looked at Lily's drawings on the refrigerator with the careful attention she brought to everything she found genuinely interesting. That evening hadn't been planned as a significant step. It had just been a Tuesday when she'd come over after work and they'd eaten takeout, and she'd fallen asleep briefly on the couch while he was doing dishes, and he'd stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her asleep on his second-hand couch and thought, there it is. There's the whole thing. She'd woken up mortified. He'd handed her a glass of water and told her she snored slightly. She'd been genuinely furious about that for 45 seconds. Then she'd laughed, and the laugh had gone on longer than the others, and after it she'd looked at him with the open version of her face and said, "Nobody has ever told me that in a voice that contained something more than the words. Nobody has ever been close enough to know," he'd thought, but hadn't said. He'd said, "It's barely a snore." More of an exhale with conviction. She'd thrown a couch pillow at him. Now she sat across from him in the coffee shop on a Saturday morning and said, "The Whitmore situation moved." He set down his cup. "What happened?" "His legal team contacted mine Thursday evening." She said it with the even, compressed quality she used for things that mattered but that she was processing steadily. They want to discuss a settlement related to the market activity in the sub-Saharan infrastructure segment, which is not an admission of anything, but is also not what innocent parties do. He blinked. He blinked. She looked at her coffee. "My attorney thinks we have enough exposure on his end to pursue formally if we choose to. The timeline you built, combined with what Cassandra documented about Mara Elston's access and movement..." She paused. "It's not nothing." "What do you want to do?" She considered the question. "I want to be done with it," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of a fight, because I have better things to do with my resources than chase Derek Whitmore through a legal process that will take 3 years and benefit nobody except the lawyers." She looked at him. "I want to negotiate terms that include a formal acknowledgement of the leak and a guarantee of no further interference with our market activity. and I want it to be over. That sounds like the right call. My attorney thinks I'm leaving money on the table. Your attorney doesn't get to decide what your time is worth. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just the small movement of a person who has received something they needed without knowing they needed it. No, she said. He doesn't. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Lily, she said. She doesn't know anything about me. She knows your name. I told her I'd made a friend. A friend? That's the age-appropriate version of the situation. We're working up to more specific vocabulary. Victoria looked at her cup. I don't have experience with this, she said. Children, specifically. Being important to a child. Being someone they have to decide about. She's 7, Nathan said. The bar is, do you show up? Are you real? Do you treat her dad with respect? She's not running a background check. Her credit score question suggests otherwise. He laughed. Fair point. He set down his cup. Victoria, she's going to like you. Not because of anything you need to perform, because you don't perform, which is actually your best quality from a 7-year-old's perspective. Kids are good at spotting the performance. Lily can smell inauthenticity from across a room. He paused. You're one of the least performative people I know, underneath the professional layer. She looked at him. That might be the most specific compliment anyone has ever given me. I'm a specific person. You are. She held his gaze. Nathan, are you? She stopped, started differently. Is this working? For you? As it actually is, not as you'd like it to be? He understood the question. She was asking about the gap, the practical distance between their lives, the difference in their worlds that hadn't disappeared because they'd decided to be in each other's lives. She was asking without euphemism, which was the only way she ever asked anything. Yes, he said, and then because she deserved the full honest version, there are days when the distance between your world and mine is visible. I'm aware of it. I'd be lying if I said it never registers. He held her gaze. And then I remember that the distance is mostly logistical, not personal, and that I've handled logistics before. It's more than logistics. Some of it, yes. He didn't look away. But the most important parts, the way we talk to each other, the way I trust what you say, the way you are when nobody's watching. He paused. Those don't have a class system. Those are just two people. She absorbed that. Then, I'm going to mess this up sometimes. I know. Not intentionally. But I will. Revert. Fall back into the managed version. Make decisions without Victoria. He said her name the same way she said his, testing the weight of it. I know. I've watched you for a month in rooms full of people who wanted things from you. I know what the managed version looks like, and I know what it costs you, and I know you'll use it when you're scared. He paused. I'll be able to tell, and I'll say so, and that'll be annoying for both of us, and then we'll get through it. She looked at him steadily. You make it sound very manageable. Most things are more manageable than they look. You told me that, actually. Not directly, but you showed me. She tilted her head. When? Every time you handled something hard without making it dramatic. He looked at her. You run a billion-dollar company. You've been doing that alone. And you're sitting across from me in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning talking honestly about being scared. He held her gaze. That's more courage than most people manage in a lifetime. Her composure held, but just barely. He could see the edge of it, the place where the thing behind it was pressing. She pressed her lips together briefly, and then she said, Stop being insightful before noon. It's difficult to manage. He smiled. I'll try. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, just the plain and complete gesture they'd both found on a cold sidewalk 3 weeks ago. Her hand on his hand. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Outside the coffee shop, Chicago was doing its Saturday morning things. Foot traffic, the particular sound of a city that had exhaled slightly from the weekday pressure. November light hitting the buildings at an angle that made them look briefly generous. They sat in it for a while, unhurried, Two people who had learned the hard way that unhurried was a choice you had to make deliberately against everything that pushed the other direction. He thought about the freight elevator. He thought about the tray of champagne glasses and the wrong word that had started everything. He thought about all the rooms he'd moved through invisible and all the things he'd learned by watching and all the ways the month had changed him without changing who he was. Only clarifying it, the way fire clarifies, burning away the parts that were just there for insulation. He thought about what his mother had said, hard-won things last. He believed that. He believed it because he was living proof of it. He'd won everything hard, nothing easy, starting from the night Lily was born and running through every difficult year after it. He'd won Lily hard. He'd won his own steadiness hard. He was winning this hard too. That was fine. Hard was what he knew. Hard was what he was built for. The difference was that now he wasn't doing it alone. Victoria picked up her coffee cup and looked at him over the rim with the full attention expression. The real one. The unmanaged one. And he looked back at her without flinching, which was the one thing he'd been able to offer from the beginning. And it had turned out to be enough. It had turned out to be the whole thing. There are people who come into your life by accident, wrong word, wrong moment, wrong tray of champagne glasses in the wrong room, and turn out to be the most deliberate thing that ever happened to you. Not because fate arranged it, and not because anyone planned it, but because two people were honest enough and steady enough and brave enough to not look away when something real appeared in front of them. That was all it was. That was everything it was. Nathan Reed, 32 years old, single father, man who read rooms for a living, took a sip of his Saturday morning coffee and thought about Lily at the farmer's market, picking out something she'd never eaten before, and about the woman across the table from him who was going to be terrified and wonderful and difficult and entirely worth it, and about the fact that his rent was paid and his daughter was happy and the next chapter had already started without making any announcements about it. He was ready. He had, it turned out, been ready for a while.